It's been a long time coming, but we're finally ready to hit the road in this car. In real time, it was around 7 months from first buying the car to when we had our first real road test. In the time since we uploaded the first episode of this series, it's been around 10 months. And in that time, we've gone through a lot of different systems in the car, making sure everything was safe, or safe enough, and ready to drive. Just to name a few, we've changed the engine oil, hood and hatch lift struts, sealed up the transmission, built a new catback exhaust, replaced the front and rear sway bar end links, cleaned out the interior, unstuck most of the lifters, rebuilt the front brake calipers, replaced the front brake line and the front hoses, rebuilt the master cylinder and bled the whole system, went through a few cooling system parts and replaced the coolant, repaired the headlight control module, performed a tape measure alignment, and a whole bunch of smaller things. But if you've been following along with this series, I guess by now we all know that. And while I do want to call this the first drive episode, it isn't technically true since in the first episode I did drive it home. And here and there, over the months, I did make some short drives with it. Then, starting in January, I started to take it for longer and longer drives. And between January and April, we put an estimated 600 miles on the car. The distance has to be estimated because the odometer is unfortunately frozen. This is a very common issue on these cars and one we will address in a future video. But for the most part, the car performed extremely well, and by that I mean we didn't get stranded anywhere. There are definitely things we'll need to address in the future, like the radiator fan that doesn't come on its own, an exhaust leak between the manifolds and the Y-pipe, and some general maintenance and why not parts that we'll be installing in this episode. But even before we did all that, the car was a blast to drive, especially once it got warm enough to take the T-tops off. The muffler we installed keeps the car very quiet actually, and once we replaced some weather stripping to stop some of the wind noise from coming in, I'm pretty sure that on the highway this will be the quietest car I own. I totally understand that that's not what a lot of people would want, but it totally performed like I hoped it would. With that said, it is a slightly anemic TBI 305 with highway gears. In 4th gear with the torque converter locked, the car runs at about 950 RPM at 40 miles an hour. It's quiet, calm, and pretty efficient. On long trips on the highway, it gets around 20 miles per gallon, and I think it can do better. When moving or with the radiator fan on, the engine stays nice and cool. The heat and defrost works in the car, although the AC doesn't. The radio sometimes kind of works, although only one speaker actually emits noise, and not all of the time. And maybe the biggest concern is that the steering is a little bit loose and it tends to bump steer a little bit. But it sure is nice to be driving the thing. Remember that this car originally came from Florida, and when I bought it, the odometer was reading 146,000 miles. And in a conversation I had with the previous owner since the first episode, he estimated that he put between 50 and 80,000 more miles onto the car after the odometer stopped working. So unfortunately it's impossible to guess exactly how many miles this car has on it, but it's safe to say at least 200,000. And over all those miles of road and 28 years, this car has been through a lot. It has seen a lot. And with all that in mind, it's sort of an honor now to be driving the car around, to get the chance to bring the car back to roadworthiness and add to its story. That exact idea, maybe not that exact story, but similar ones, are the reason we're here making these videos today. We're not just here to turn wrenches or cuss at the cars or have a laugh, although of course those are things that happen along the way. We're here to make stories, and tell stories and share those stories with all of you. But it's actually even greater than that. All of you are part of this. You're part of the story, the journey of this, well, dilapidated car hitting the road again. And granted, we didn't put the car together from scratch using boxes of parts we found in Grandma's barn, but that doesn't mean we can't have a connection to the thing. That doesn't mean we can't have connections to other people through those things. Everyone has their own story. They have a memory, a moment, a person associated with a car like this, or just any car at all. This car hasn't attracted attention because it's rare, or particularly valuable, or particularly fast. It's definitely not that. But because of a connection, or a memory, or maybe you just think it's a good-looking car, we're all here making these videos together. And that's why it was so special to finally be driving this car. And the car does drive well, but there's definitely room for improvement, and there are some general maintenance tasks that we should probably take care of. And we'll get started by jacking up the front of the car. But unfortunately, with the slightly smaller tires, and I guess the suspension has settled a bit more, the car sits low enough that this 4-ton jack doesn't really fit under it. So to get a little bit of extra clearance for it, we'll drive the car up on boards, then roll the jack under it and lift it up. And there we go. We'll set the front of the car down on jack stands and make sure the parking brake is firmly set. And with the hood open, we'll reach down into the engine bay and see what we can do about our first task, replacing the spark plugs. Of course, first the wire has to be moved out of the way. By twisting the spark plug wire boot, we could pretty quickly remove it from the plug. These wires don't appear that old, and they're not super stuck in place. We had previously removed the wire from this plug, the one in the number 1 cylinder, and checked it in an earlier episode. The plug that we checked was in good shape, except on the outside where it was very rusty. And all of the others are no different. The main danger here is that they rust to the point where when you try to remove a spark plug, it just strips or breaks off. None of the plugs on this engine were near that point, but it's a good piece of preventative maintenance. In this case, it's mostly preventative of the comments that keep telling us to replace them. It's not the easiest thing to get a wrench on these spark plugs, but a spark plug socket that will retain the plug once it's loose will help. And there we go, that is the first plug removed. We'll be replacing those spark plugs with these AC Delco ones. They're simple, cheap, time-tested, and will do the job just fine. Still, with any spark plug, it's always a good idea to test the gap for yourself. The Haynes manual calls for a 0.035 inch gap, and that is what these plugs appear to already be set for. Still, it's a good idea to check each one before installing it. You want to feel just a little bit of drag when pulling the gauge through the gap. That same Haynes manual suggests tightening these spark plugs down to 22 foot-pounds, which seems a bit high, and we're just going to go with the usual for a small block Chevy, which is 15 foot-pounds. We'll put a dab of anti-seize on the threads of the spark plug and get it into place. And once we have it threaded most of the way in by hand, we'll go ahead and torque it down. And we're done. Well, with that one, because now we have to get the rest of them. The number 3 cylinder we were also able to get to from up top without too much effort. And the same goes for the number 5 spark plug. Well, not exactly the same because it took a lot more effort, but it still was doable from up top. And we took care of that one, but the number 7 is pretty much unreachable from up top, and that's why we lifted the car into the air. From beneath the car, it was fairly easy to get the spark plug loose, removed, and a new one installed. And then we'll move to the passenger side. These are even trickier. Starting with the number 2 spark plug, we'll get them all loose. It turned out to be pretty much impossible to film this, and I couldn't really even see what I was doing for most of them, so we'll just skip ahead to when we had all the old ones removed and the new ones installed. And here are all of the old, crusty spark plugs. Most of the electrodes appear pretty normal, although the one that came out of the number 8 cylinder is a little bit dark. But since before they were pulled, the engine had been idling for a while, and there was a period where the lifters were sticking, and who knows what else. I don't think we should read too much into that since the engine is still running well. So even though these plugs weren't the worst, and they weren't the most fun to replace, I am glad we have new ones in the engine. And to continue in that vein, another thing that's often overlooked is the power steering fluid. Most people, if the system is working correctly, will just leave it in there and never even think about it. But power steering fluid is cheap, and this oil is definitely old. I can't guarantee it, but it wouldn't be terribly surprising if most of this was factory original. We'll use one of our fluid syringes with a vacuum hose attached to remove as much of the fluid from the power steering pump as we can. Then we'll use a funnel and pour in some fresh, new power steering fluid. It's common to use transmission fluid in power steering pumps, and some of them are designed that way, some of them aren't. I figure we might as well just use actual power steering fluid. It's not really any more expensive than ATF, and these pumps were designed for it. This particular kind does not include stop leak additives. And once we think we have it about right, we'll reinstall the cap and check the fluid level. To really flesh out the system, over the next few months we'll repeat this process a few times. That way we can be confident that we have as much new, clean fluid in the system as possible. And speaking of new, clean fluids, we've put a few hundred miles on the car, so I think it's about time we changed the oil again. Before we really started driving the car, we added some Seafoam and Marvel Mystery Oil to it, so it's kind of a mess. We also did at one point drain out the oil and then pour it back in, which a lot of people were pretty unhappy with. So now I think it's about time that we change the oil filter and actually put some new oil in the engine. And to start this process, we'll remove the drain plug and get rid of that old oil. There was no small amount of controversy from that first episode where we used the impact gun to remove the drain plug, so if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, I suppose you should avert your eyes. The oil was kind of brown and darker than you'd normally expect for 600 miles, but also not that pitch black that you usually see after using Seafoam. Of course, there was also mystery oil in the mix, and it was knockoff Seafoam, so it's a little hard to say exactly what that means. And next up is the oil filter. Again, in that first episode, there were a lot of comments telling us to avoid the mess by simply poking a hole in the oil filter and draining it before it's removed from the vehicle. And after punching that hole and letting it drain for a bit, we'll use an oil filter wrench to remove it. Once we've loosened it up a little bit, we'll unthread it by hand and with no drippage, remove it from the vehicle. The secret to the technique is to make sure you punch a hole through the filler element cap inside of the oil filter so that the oil passage can completely drain too. I guess we just didn't punch through far enough to get through the cap of the filter element. But I also don't like the method because what I usually do is take the old filter and put it in the cardboard box of the new filter and let it sit around on a shelf for a while until I take my next trip to a recycling center. But once you've punched a hole in it, the oil from the filter element is going to leak out pretty much forever, and you'd have to seal it up or put it in a thick plastic bag or something to keep that from happening. Anyway, we're just here to change the oil. We'll thread back in the drain plug and try to clean up some of the mess we made trying to make less of a mess, and we'll take our new oil filter, pre-filled with oil, and thread it into place. We'll tighten it by hand until the seal makes contact. Then we'll tighten it a bit past that, in this case it was about another half turn. And we'll torque down that drain plug to 20 foot-pounds. But based on some of the cars I've seen, I don't think that's tight enough. Most people really tighten those bolts down. I mean, it makes sense, you really don't want that to come loose. So just to be safe, we'll just give it a kiss with the impact gun. Yep, just a few taps, do not want to over-tighten that. I learned that method from some of the quick oil change guys. I also learned this one. I'm just terrified of the oil filter coming loose, so we'll do what most previous owners do and get that oil filter extra snug. And there we go, there is no way oil is coming out of this ever again. So we'd better go fill it up. None of the lifters seem to be sticking anymore, but there's still some clickety-clacky happening. So this time we'll try another classic fix, Lucas Heavy Duty Oil Stabilizer. You can find this for a decent price, and I paid less than $10 for the bottle. You can see that, out of the bottle, this stuff is very thick. Once it's exposed to heat and thinned out with the rest of the oil though, it doesn't really seem any different from regular engine oil viscosity. And with that quart of oil stabilizer in there, we'll add 4 quarts of 5W30. And we'll cap it off and call it good to go. Since most of the lifters had already quieted down for the most part, it's a little hard to say exactly how much difference that engine oil stabilizer made, but it's worth a try. And there was one other thing I wanted to take care of while the car was still in the air. It was something I couldn't quite stop thinking about. Despite my best efforts to cover this one up, I couldn't help but think, and some of the comments pushed me into thinking, that a bolt and a nut would actually be a better idea than using the fastener in the cracked threads. There were no symptoms, and as far as I could tell the cracks hadn't gone anywhere, but it was still kinda eating at me. At least the transmission to driveshaft seal still seems to be holding, and the driveshaft still fits nicely in that new bushing. But that tailshaft housing bolt was just my telltale heart. So we put together a stack of extensions that would get a socket on it and removed that bolt. And we'll replace that bolt going into the threads on the transmission with a smaller bolt and a nut on the other side. This way, at least that bolt isn't constantly trying to spread out the crack in those threads. It should hopefully be a little bit less force, and a lot better than just having 3 bolts in the tailshaft housing. The reason we didn't do this in the first place was because of the difficulty of getting the nut on the other side of the bolt. In order to get a washer on there, we shaved one down on the belt sander. Then we installed the bolt from the front of the vehicle and put the nut on the outside of the tailshaft housing. There's a washer on each side, and we used a lock nut to make sure it wouldn't come loose. We tried to torque it down, but it ended up being too difficult to hold the thing still and do that at the same time, so we just got it snug. And there you go. That is something that at least I can tell my brain is probably better, and we don't have to think about it anymore. And I think we'll end this episode there. In the next episode, we'll see what we can do about the loose steering. We have a replacement part, an upgrade part, and we'll be readjusting the steering box. Hopefully one or all of those things will get the car feeling a little bit more safe. And certainly more fun to drive. Because, well, that is still the plan for this car. Just to get it on the road and drive it. And everything we did in this episode was really just adding a little bit of extra peace of mind to that, since it already ran and drove pretty well for those first 600 or so miles. Well, it's a bit silly to call them the first miles, as it already has at least 200,000 on it, but you know what I mean. I can only hope that we'll put many, many more miles on the car in the future, and that we can continue to create and share those stories that connect us all.